From the journalists at the Tennessee Firefly, this is On the Fly, your bi-weekly deep dive into the important education issues you need to know about. I am Firefly Managing Editor Sky Arnold, sitting right next to Knox County Mayor Glenn Jacobs, who, as we all know, had a Hall of Fame career as a professional wrestler, Kane. And it's in that capacity you got to know President Trump's nominee for to be the Secretary of Education, Linda McMahon. Really appreciate you spending some time talking to us, Mayor. If you wouldn't mind, I'd like to start this conversation with just sort of how you met Linda and what people should know about her.
Linda is brilliant. When folks think about WWE, they always think about Vince McMahon and the visionary and the entrepreneur of the company, which is true. Linda was the business side. She was the person that ran the back office for many years. She was also on the Connecticut State Board of Education. She's been politically active throughout her life. So it was no surprise to me when President Trump dubbed her or deemed her to be his nominee for Secretary of Education. She is an incredibly competent individual, very smart, very sharp.
So we're obviously here to talk about education, but I have to ask you about a video clip that has made all kinds of news. It's been all over of you and Linda McMahon. I think it was from a Monday Night Raw episode where you body slammed her. Would you mind telling us that story? How did that come about? Whose idea was that?
Yeah, so it was actually our creative team. We have writers at WWE just like other shows do. And it was their idea because my character Kane had just been repackaged, and they wanted him basically just to be a monster that didn't recognize any sort of restraints or rules. And how better to get that across than to body slam the boss's wife, basically. But the Linda was obviously she'd done some stuff in front of the camera before. She's a good performer, and she was great, to work with, and just wanted to make sure that everything looked as convincing as possible. My job was to make sure that she didn't get hurt. Yeah. So trust me, that I took very, very good care of her, making sure that she was okay.
Linda's appointment has not been without its controversy. Some have sort of criticized her as not having the background that we typically see with the Secretary of Education. I know that you don't necessarily agree that with those who say she's the wrong choice. You disagree with them strongly. What should people who are concerned about her or who are maybe questioning her background, what should they know about her, and why do you think she's the perfect choice?
Well, I think one thing that we have to understand is there's a difference between teachers and administrators, and then obviously when you go to something like the Department of Education, that's just a completely different ballgame. So as I said, she does have a background in education, being on the Connecticut State Board of Education. So I'm sure she can take many of the things that she learned while she was there and apply them to this role. Then also, a lot of this it's managing people, policy, budgets, finances. You're not going to find anyone better at those things than she is. And she also, she is very in line with President Trump's vision. School choice across America, downsizing the Department of Education, potentially eliminating it. Of course, that would be a process. But those are all things that she is very attuned to his vision.
Good transition there. Of course, the president has talked about dismantling the Department of Education, said he is appointing Linda McMahon to do that job. As you mentioned, complexities there abound. Congress may have to be involved and whatnot. But setting that aside, do you think she really does want to dismantle the Department of Education? And if so, why?
Well, anything that the federal government does ends up being incredibly complicated, and there are so many things that should be left to the states. Education is one of those. From a strictly constitutional perspective, the United States Constitution does not talk about education. The 10th Amendment says that things that the Constitution powers not granted to Congress are reserved to the states. So there's your argument to begin with. The Department of Education is only about 45 years old to begin with. It was started under Jimmy Carter. It hasn't been around that long. But the issue is just it has tentacles in everything. And also, it shouldn't impact funding because we already send basically how the federal government works. I think sometimes people think that the federal government has this big vault of money that only they have access to. No, they get the money from us to begin with, and it goes to them, and then in a lot of cases, these massive bureaucracies end up keeping a large portion of that money, so what comes back to the states is smaller than what we pay into. So for those reasons, I do think that it needs to be greatly downsized, ultimately eliminated. Also, when you think about our country, it's just different and different. We have 50 states, and different areas of the country, and I know this from my travels, are just very different. So when it comes to something like education, I think that the more local that we can have it, or at least at the state level, the better.
So in a hypothetical world, let's say the Department of Education doesn't go away, it stays intact, Linda McMahon is running it. What sort of reforms do you think she'll champion, and how do you envision education, public education in particular, looking differently?
Sure. Well, one thing is school choice, and they've talked about that. They would have pushed that across the country. President Trump endorsed Governor Lee's Education Freedom Act. So that's something that we'd see more of. I'd like to see personally more CTE, career and technical education opportunities. When we think about the secondary level, and colleges, some changes there as well. We have a desperate need in this country for computer scientists, for engineers, for the more technical occupations, and I'd really like to see more of our secondary institutions concentrate on those things to make us in the United States be a viable player in innovation and technology, which is where the global economy is going to. I just think in general you'd see a much more streamlined operation and much less of a bureaucracy than we currently do. And I think that more, even if the Department of Education stays there, I do think that you would have the states have more say over their education systems.
One just sort of final question I thought I'd throw at you. As you know, there is a lot of criticism of the dismantling the Department of Education. A lot of folks in particular who have children with disabilities, for example, are concerned about that. Knowing Linda, do you see anything in her that you would like to tell those folks not to be worried?
Oh no, she's a very compassionate person. And again, when we talk about dismantling the federal Department of Education, no one's talking about doing that at the state level. What we're really talking about is returning the authority and the funding to the states as well. And those provisions are already here in Tennessee as well. So change is always difficult, and a lot of times when you hear these things, you completely freak out because, oh, this is going away. No, it's not going away. It's being replaced by something else. I graduated high school in 1985. So for the majority of my K through 12 experience, there was no federal Department of Education. And that's true for many, many people around this country. So even if the federal Department of Education goes away, that does not mean certainly that the states will not fulfill what we've already been doing in many cases.
Mayor Jacobs, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us and adding your insight on this issue. And that'll do it for this edition of On the Fly. Catch us bi-weekly where you get your podcasts. I'm Sky Arnold.